part of Eros is unpredictability. And ultimately, part of Eros is that we become bigger people. Why can't human beings ever shut down Eros? Because there is an inexorable impulse to transcend yourself, to become a bigger person than you are now. And unless we can surrender to that vulnerability and unpredictability and out of controlness and unpreparedness, effectively, we're struggling against Eros. We're in a condition where Eros has to take us rather than us willingly being already aligned and proactive. You know, in the Greek mythology, it's one of the wonderful things about doing things in Greece, because there's all this cultural richness of Greek mythology in the background. Why did the ancient Greeks imagine Eros as a little cherub that shoots arrows? Yeah. But once he shoots his arrow at you, you are gone. You're out of control. You will fall in love, whatever happens. Doesn't matter what you want, whether you don't want, what your ego says. You know, the arrow has got you. No, you need to be able, mature loving requires that you're not so defended against love that you can actually consciously invite it and contribute to it and initiate it and volunteer yourself. So it doesn't all have to happen in spite of you. When modern psychotherapy was invented, discovered by Freud, Sigmund Freud, it was all about sex, because that was in the Victorian age, and his thinking was all about sex and the repressed sexuality of his day. But when he started investigating and exploring this, he got shocked. He got freaked. You could say he got traumatized. And that trauma and the reaction against it, mainly, still lives in our profession. It still circumscribes our profession. We're a traumatized profession, and like a traumatized person, we are a little rigid. We contract, we are afraid. We stick to rigid guidelines, very unerotic, rigid guidelines. You know, nothing turns anybody off as much as rigidity. We still suffer Freud's shock. And Freud wasn't alone. Huh? He was working with his colleague Breuer. And Breuer, what we know from Breuer is that he got shocked even more than Freud. Because what happened? What happened is that they developed this way of offering sessions, offering therapy, where they offered an open space, you know, initially a space of free association, where they were inviting the patient just to come and talk freely, and they were going to listen to anything and everything that the patient offered. So all they offered really was a regular, reliable listening space. There is a well-known psychoanalyst in the UK who's written a book on psychoanalysis called, I think, Cassandra's Daughter, about psychoanalysis. And he proposed that one of the great inventions made by Freud was nothing other than to provide regular, predictable sessions. Rather than making appointments here and the doctor can't see you and the doctor has somebody else and maybe I will see you and maybe I won't see you. He said, we will meet at the same time every week. Whether you do psychoanalysis or whether you do flower arranging or you get together every week at the same time to bake a cake, profound things will happen between the two people involved. That regularity and predictability and reliability, that commitment to the attachment, sets things in motion in the psyche. it creates a connection between the people involved. And it unleashes a process in everybody involved, like a therapeutic process. Just that. You don't need to do more than that. And in that space, in that regular, reliable, committed space, Freud offered what he called evenly hovering attention. In psychoanalysis, they talk about it as a kind of neutral. It's not positive, it's not negative, it's not promising anything, it's not denying anything, it's just neutral. That because he had the requirement and the idea that he wanted to be scientific about it. And as a scientist, you need to be objective, so you can't be too invested. You can't have an agenda, you can't be, so you have to be neutral. In the humanistic tradition, we are not restricted in that way. So in the humanistic tradition, we enter the space with what Carl Rogers called the core conditions. So we are basically benign. We offer benign attention, benign listening. Now, when you offer that kind of thing, which I think is actually what Freud offered, although he wouldn't call it like that himself. But when you offer that kind of thing, a shocking thing occurred. And I say it in the article, if you'd read it. That's my opening few paragraphs. If you offer regular, committed attachment for the space for an attachment to be formed, and in that space you offer benign attention, it's very likely that the other person will fall in love with you. Why is that? Freud and Breuer were shocked. These young women, you know, they were old geezers, as they say in English. They were old men. They would not, why would any young woman fall in love with them? Well, because they were giving regular sessions, regular attention, and a kind of benign attention. That's all that was needed for a young woman to fall in love with a highly incompatible older man. Why is that? They were shocked by it. They were shocked by the intensity. They were shocked by the intensity of the love that the women expressed towards them. But of course, they were more shocked by their own reaction. They were completely freaked by their own reaction. They call it the countertransference, but they were freaked. Like Breuer spent more time with his patient than with his wife, and until the wife put a stop to it. And he escaped. He had to go on holiday to, you know, because he couldn't hack it. So they were shocked. They were shocked by the intensity of erotic dynamics that got unleashed in the therapeutic space. And they were so shocked that they put in place theories, understandings, guidelines, way of practicing, which were designed to make this safe. And they've been so successful in making it safe that over the last few decades, hardly anybody in therapy thinks about sexuality, erotic anything. We still know it's a taboo, and you know, we still know that it occasionally happens. But you know, over 100 years, we have been pretty successful in making it so safe that it has become highly harmless and inefficient. People have all kinds of transformative expectations of therapy, but if you want transformation, you know that by definition, it's going to be risky and dangerous. Like transformation means I'm going through a process where I will evolve into somebody that I wouldn't recognize at the beginning, because it's a completely different person. It's a transformed person. Now, that can never be a safe process. Anybody who says that that is going to be safe is you selling you snake oil. Instead of that unsafety, what people offer is a kind of like, how many therapists do you know who say, I'm offering a safe space to my clients? You know, that's how many people put that on their website. I'm offering a safe space for my clients. Do you? Well, it's so safe that it's harmless. Nothing much will happen. Not on the deep levels that people come to therapy for. You can't offer transformation and safety at the same time. That's a contradiction in terms. So we've made it safe, and our professional associations are, you know, an expression of that. But a lot of the erotic fuel that was there between Freud and Breuer and his patients has got shut down. So what we want to think about, and there are not many people who say this in therapy. I have prepared the references and the articles and handouts and things that I have included. They were very selected because it's hard to find good stuff out there that speaks about this. There's not that much around. So the people who have talked about this and thought about this, and who similarly, you know, can take a passionate position on it the way I'm doing right now, they're few and far between. So I will give you some of the references, you know, in the course of me talking about this. Most of the people who have thought about this deeply and in a kind of, let's say, inviting way, inviting of eros way, consider it part of the fuel of the therapeutic process. They consider it part of the energy, the vitality that makes therapy work. It's like the fuel in the engine. Unless you put fuel in the car won't go very far. So we need to recover from that shock that Freud and Breuer have generously passed down to us, down the generations. We need to recover from that. It's like a trauma that you need to recover from, and especially the protections around the trauma. I can guarantee you that it's not going to be straightforward. It's going to be complex, paradoxical, uncertainty making. It's not going to be predictable and safe. Let's have a little break in my ramblings and give a bit of space for you to come into the group and say things. You see, you thought you were going to have 45 safe minutes of being talked at. Now I've spoiled it. Now I've made it unsafe already. Now you have to expose yourself if you want to. You see, immediately you're in conflict. Am I going to say something? Am I not going to say something? Oh, I could just, you know, there's 80 people. I can hide. You know, I could hide for, if this went on for a week, I could hide for a week amongst 80 people. But maybe you want to say something. Maybe you actually have reactions against or towards what I'm saying. So, is anybody going to say anything?
It is so weird. Like, I would love to participate, but it's like, okay, say something, and you're what to say? What is it?
Oh, you just say something about I've given you enough stuff. I've put enough stuff in the pot. You just have a reaction to what I said.
Okay, so to me, sorry, I start because no one else was speaking.
Don't apologize. If they want to be unerotic and quiet and passive, that's up to them. They can waste their time. It's none of your business.
I feel fright of transference and counter-transference and what is going on in here, and the morality in it. Am I doing something wrong? Am I breaking the rules? Am I trespassing into the other person? Am I doing damage? So this is one segment of my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense to me. Normally, when you ask group members to come into the group, and you do a go round, you know, even if we were just 10 people and we did a go round, 3/4 of the people would say something like, I am interested and excited to be here, but I'm also a little anxious to expose myself. Like most people would say that. That is so general. That's almost inconvertibly true. And it's true for coming into a group. It's true for getting attracted to somebody. It's true for making love. You should be a mixture of excited and scared. Because if proper making love happens, you're going to be naked, and the other person will see straight through you, everything, hopefully. And if you are aware that you carry with you some kind of shield of defensive baggage, then that will become apparent, that will become obvious. So if you go forward into desire, into lovemaking, then your defenses are immediately present, your habitual defenses. I don't know how many of you use the word defenses. It's a tricky notion, but we can use other notions, but I just give me some leeway with using that notion. What might I mean by that? I can talk for several hours about how the field of psychotherapy has discovered or formulated that notion of defenses. From the very beginning, Freud talked about defenses, Reich talks about defenses, everybody, the whole field is full of some awareness of defenses. It must be pointing at something that human beings carry around with them, or that they do. We defend ourselves. Anybody else want to say anything?
I'd like to say something. Hello, Michael. Hello, everyone.
I'm listening. Yeah, hi.
It's about what goes silent, and there may be some of that with us in the group. The what goes silent about working with the erotic, and the conflict I feel inside myself around a psychodynamic understanding that says you somehow must frustrate any erotic feelings in the client, and my humanistic body psychotherapy me that is furious about that and thinks it's really sadistic, and yes. I have a battle going on inside, and one of the ways that I protect myself is to drop into the silence. But of course it's going on all the time in relationships. So
yes.
Belief when you bring yourself in with this daring to be with the messiness and the aliveness of it.
Yes. No, that I find that very helpful. I think implied in what you're saying is that we haven't achieved yet a full integration of those conflicting traditions, the humanistic and the psychoanalytic. And that we're still somewhat paralyzed and trapped between them. It is possible, I think, to integrate them. It is possible. This conflict has been going on for the best part of, 6 decades now. And it's crippling the field of psychotherapy. Nobody can think hardly straight about anything because we're so crippled by that unresolved conflict. But I think it is possible to integrate it to the point, not out there, but in oneself, in the way that you're talking. It is possible to find an integration where they don't keep blocking each other and blocking you. But what we need to do, one stepping stone towards that, is that we need to dismantle the simplistic projections that they have made into each other in the course of keeping that conflict stuck. So the projections that the humanistic people have into the psychoanalysts is that they are remote, defended, shoring up their kind of clinical authority, power invested, disconnected, mentally reflecting stick people that don't really have a body. Well, for some psychoanalysts, that caricature has some truth in it. But if you put yourself about in the field and you meet humans in those two camps, then you find out that they're not all like that. And of course, in preparation for this, I have pursued and searched for and found psychoanalysts who very much sound like full embodied humans who are passionate about passion. It is possible to find them. And of course, the reverse is also true, that the psychoanalytic part of you would need to notice what kind of projections habitually have been made into the humanistic faction, into the humanistic tradition, and to deconstruct these projections, because they are reductions. They are reductions of the full humanity of the other side, like it happens in any polarization like that. These people are much bigger than the caricature that we put onto them. I've been breaking my head and heart and body over this integration for decades. And I think, like I said, the good news is it is possible to find a position of integration where they enhance each other rather than block each other. So whatever I do out there, whatever I teach, that's what I'm trying to convey, and that's what I'm trying to help you discover for yourself.
I would like to add one more thing that was getting touched to me as you were speaking, which is a fear that I might not hold a boundary enough for a child or teenage part in my client.
Of course, yes. That's
when I'm dealing with something on an erotic level in an adult part, because of course they can switch really quickly.
That's right. They coexist and they can switch quickly. That's right.
Yeah.
So anybody who's concerned, as if you've read the article, you've seen there repeatedly me saying the erotic is dangerous. One of the big achievements of the 21st century in the West is that we do understand now publicly how prevalent sexual abuse of children actually has become. In all kinds of places where it was completely denied, probably worst in the places, like I'm thinking of the church, where it was denied most, it's been most prevalent. And the abuse and the damage and the horrific destruction that gets wrought by that, by adults using children for their sexual gratification, that's out there now. That's not going to go back in the box. And that is horrendous. You can like one of my early trainers used to say, for an adult to be so deluded to think that their sexuality can somehow physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually relate to a child through sexual expression is putting 100,000 volts through a little light bulb. And the light bulb is going to break. I think that's true. So no, anybody who understands that degree of trauma and damage and abuse would have to be worried about risking eros in relation to anybody. Because as soon as we understand that human beings are not Disney figures, they're not one-dimensional in the way that sometimes humans present themselves. As soon as we have some kind of psychological depth perspective, we understand, and this is crucial to also what I was going to talk about, what I've prepared, is that the child, all the children that you ever were, or that I ever was, coexist with my supposed adult now. And if I fall in love with somebody, and if I'm attracted to somebody, or if I erotically engage with somebody, then the whole package of me engages. All the children come along, all the adults come along, all the different parts of me come along, and they are all engaged in this encounter with all their different needs, their different longings, their different desires, their different defenses. They are all engaged. And as you so wisely said, things are not necessarily what they appear. You know, one part can be disguised by another part that is currently in the foreground, but these things can flip in a millisecond. And I may be reaching out to a woman and we may touch each other, and the touch a second later makes her regress into being a girl. But I'm still 5 seconds in the past where she seemed to be inviting it. And I need to be sensitive. You know, and the reverse is also true. I was just talking for myself there. So psychological depth and sensitivity requires that we are sensitive to these kinds of changes in each other, to the multiplicity of different levels of experience, and how present the children, our past experience, the child experiences are in the present moment. So that's understanding that. And this is, of course, I said I would pick a topic for tonight of all the kind of huge theme of Eros. I was going to pick a circumscribed topic for making it manageable for tonight, which is already halfway out the door because I've already been talking for 38 minutes, is to understand that point, that we're not adults, and that the children are present, and that the wounded children are present, and therefore the defenses against the wounded children are present. And unless we have that minimum understanding, nobody understands what goes on in couples and why love goes wrong, why desire goes wrong, why people get together and, you know, they make love every day and night, 24/7 for a while. And then after a few months or after a couple of years, they don't have sex at all. You know, the number of sexless committed relationships in modern history is astonishing. You know, how many couples are sexless? So how does that happen? Unless we have that understanding that you opened up, Julie, we cannot understand that. We can't even get anywhere near understanding that. So let me talk for a few minutes and show a few slides. So there, as you know, there's going to be a weekend on this topic. This is just the introduction. There are the learning objectives, which are part of the article. I was, you know, step by step preparing for this. So I thought, let's look at different definitions of Eros. It's not important. One thing of the complexities of love that hints at that is that in different languages, there are many words. In Greek, apparently, there are 4 words, as it says there on the left. That tells us that love is inherently complex, because there's different kinds of loving. And one of the naive assumptions is that all of these different kinds of love can neatly, harmoniously come together in relation to our partner. That's naive. One person, just to show you the prevalent dominance of naive, psychologically naive ideas out there in the world, is this person. You know, like, and many people find this helpful. I'm not denigrating the fact that people find this helpful. But this guy talks about, Gary Chapman talks about, you know, when you search on the internet about what's difficult about love, blah, 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 eventually you come to this person. And he's written several books on the 5 love languages. And there are couples who try to use this. And some of them say that it really helps them. And, you know, you can see there at the bottom, there are 5 ways in which people express love and they want to receive love. But then he says, look, the first sentence here, seldom do a husband and wife have the same primary love language. So one person wants words of affirmation when they feel most loved, but the other person's primary language of love is receiving gifts or acts of service or something like that. Why would that be? I mean, if human beings have any sense, they would get attracted to and get together in relationships where they have the same primary love language, where they feel loved and express love in ways that are mutually enhancing. Why would it be seldom? He never asked that question. You see, this is how superficial people think, because they don't think psychologically, they don't investigate what creates somebody's preference for one of these love languages. What's the psychology, the depth of the soul that generates what is observable and identifiable as a preference? You know, this is the person's desire. They feel loved when they hear words of affirmation. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm saying it is gloriously superficial and gloriously uncurious about the depth of the soul, where this is just the manifestation, the superficial manifestation. So one of the things I got excited about is making a long list of the pervasive psychological naivety regarding love, sex, and sexuality and everything. And I think I could have spent several days making a list of especially in the West, but not only in the West. I know there's some of you from Pakistan here, and I've been to Pakistan many times now. And and somebody also sent an email earlier about, could I please talk about the cultural implications of this? And of course, they are vast. I'll talk about it in one sentence. The cultural differences in this regard are vast, okay? But everywhere there seems to be, all across the globe, what seems to be pervasive is a psychological naivety about what makes love work and what damages it. So one of the things that as I responded to Julie, validating what Julie said, is that we need to understand the depth of the human psyche. And one just tiny little slither of that depth is that in life, in our life history, in our life journey, the past is present. The past is present now in your body, in your feelings, in the structures of your mind. The early attachment, the way your mother held you and cuddled you or didn't, or the way she changed her diaper, the way she regulated her feeling, affect regulation, is living on in the way that your mind, your supposedly own mind, attends to your feelings. There is a parallel for most of us between you have a strong feeling and the way your mind reacts to that is very similar to the way your mother handled you in changing your diapers, or when you had feelings, when you cried. So the past attachments, all the past from very early on, from when you're an infant, baby, child, all the injuries of love, all the heartbreaks, teenage loves, everything is present now. You cannot relate to your partner now, or you cannot get attracted to anybody without bringing all of that along in the very being that you are and as which you engage. And unless we take that into account, we cannot understand why love goes wrong, why couples fight, why couples hate each other, why couples break up, why couples can't have sex, why, we can't understand these things, I don't think. So some of the naive assumptions are that out there in the world, some of the naive assumptions are that human beings are mainly seeking love and intimacy, as if that for many therapists, maybe for you also, in recent years, some therapies boil down to dating coaching. The person comes to you for therapy, and actually all they want is for you to help them find a mate through a dating site. And you coach them, all the encounters they have and what they put on their profile, that seems to be all that their therapy is about. They want dating coaching, always on the assumption that they are desperate to find a partner. 9 times out of 10, that person who's desperate to find somebody is not at all ready for love. All that desperate seeking flies in the face of something that's very obvious to you when you're sitting opposite them, which is that they are unavailable to love. Even if love came and hit them over the head, they wouldn't notice. And that's at the same time as desperately seeking love. So that's very naive. We need to understand that human beings are afraid of love and very, very defensive against its possibility. So unless you have that psychological understanding that there's a conflict, yes, there are desperate longings, definitely, but there are also desperately blind protections and defenses. And like Schopenhauer had that image of human beings being like hedgehogs. They need to huddle together for warmth, but they also have these spikes where they hurt each other. And so then they avoid each other. So the whole thing is profoundly conflicted. So, I mean, I'll send you the slides later. You can go through all of these, these assumptions. That just took me 5 minutes. I could have gone on for hours. So one important thing, like in these different love languages, is that there are different kinds of loving, like these different words in the different languages already indicate. And in the romantic ideal of the West, there is the assumption, this is like Disney, like when I talk in the article about, the modern psyche, Western psyche being Disneyfied and Hollywoodized. We think that as humans, we actually are these people in Disney films, one-dimensional people. And sometimes I say, well, life is not a Disney film, it's a French film, if anything. But teenagers' fantasies of love and who they are attracted to and how to have sex and are pervaded by Hollywood images. Their imaginations are structured and clouded and overglossed by Hollywood. Hollywood is running people's erotic imagination. You would have to get beyond all that, discard all that, if you actually want to stand a chance of making love. I mean, I'm not making love in terms of sex, but also making love, the labor of the everyday grind of making love, creating love, loving, making love, the labor. It's a labor that needs daily attention and depth. It needs that kind of depth that we're talking about. One other collectively, astonishingly naive assumption is that human beings get attracted to each other because of compatibility. Do you know that on all these dating websites, the algorithms, all the mathematics and the complicated, all the AI kind of wisdom that goes into this is completely blind, because it only calculates compatibility. But any person out there can tell you the way human beings get attracted. Yes, they get attracted to compatibility. I don't know what the sociological research is. I forget the numbers, but in the end, many relationships end up with somebody who is in a compatible social sphere in terms of education and money and social status. And, clearly compatibility is important. But equally, and maybe more so when it comes to actual eros and attraction, everybody knows that opposites attract. So what are the dating sites doing when they're only computing compatibility? So why is that opposites attract? That needs to be psychologically investigated. I can give you the headline. The headline is that a vast chunk of people's attraction is not love. They're not seeking love. They're seeking compensation for their childhood wounds. It's just they seek contradiction to their childhood wounds. And they find a partner who, out of their own defensive structure and defensive reasons, seems to promise a guarantee of contradicting my wound. And what people call love, what oils the wheels of initial attraction, is much more this promise of compensation than actual love. I mean, most of the time people don't know what love is, because love, that shouldn't be called love. Or at least we should reserve another word for, you know, something that's beyond this kind of compensation seeking. So I would reserve the word love for something else. I mean, some people might just talk about some kind of polarity between love and need. You know, it's what there's a difference between what I need and what I want. And then there's a difference, you know, between that and love, because love is destructive. That's what the naive assumptions don't factor in, that we're attracted to transcendence of who we are. Deep down, we have an intuition that love is meant to make us bigger people. But that means destroying the person I am now. Except that Hollywood doesn't tell you about that. And we don't like that. I don't want to be destroyed. No, I want to know who I am and be who I am. And then I want you to love that. And, you know, this is the modern kind of pop psychology speak. I'm aware of my needs and I deserve to have what I want. And I know what I want. And I'm going to make a good partner because, you know, I'm clear about myself and in myself. And I know what I want. And I know the kind of partner I want. Well, good luck with that, because it doesn't factor in your deep impulse towards self-transcendence and the fact that everything you're so certain about in terms of knowing yourself desires to be destroyed. So to make room for you becoming a bigger person. So there's many pervasive, psychologically naive assumptions about love and sex and everything. So I just talked about this kind of choosing compatible partners versus attracting the opposite. So there's some mix going on. When you look, you know, when you work with couples and you inquire into how they found each other and what happened at the beginning of their relationship and what made them fall in love. You know, they fell, they were out of control, they fell. Eros shot an arrow at them. And then you investigate that and you find the depth, the many layers of attraction and the many layers of contradictory attraction. And then they get attracted and then they go on this whole journey, which people don't allow for, which is basically that they get attracted to each other's defenses out of a compensatory impulse. And then they spend years destroying each other's defenses in order to get to the real person underneath them. So that process requires that we destroy each other's defenses. And most people don't know about that. Most people go into the relationship and think they're just going to grow rather than be destroyed. But they signed up for being destroyed. Unconsciously, they signed up for having their defenses destroyed. So we need to understand about internal conflict and what Julie said about, you know, the children are always present. So the most simple, it takes us some distance towards accepting that point. The most simple model for that would be transactional analysis. But then, of course, it gets a lot more complicated when you actually start applying it, which is why transactional analysis, it started with 3 circles, parent, adult, child. But then very quickly, they developed into 9 circles because there's a parent, adult, child in each of the circles. And then it gets very quickly gets more complicated again, because there's many different complex conflicting parts in the psyche. But if you want to understand how couples don't get on, then transactional analysis is a good starting point. You know, like if you work with ordinary people who haven't thought about the psyche and their wounds and their development, then it's a good starting point. So we need to approach the whole area of desire and love and sexuality and why it's working and why it's not working with at least with that kind of understanding that each of us brings parent aspects, adult aspects, and child aspects to the relationship. But even that is not, I mean, that's a first step. That's a stepping stone, which is good. But if you search out there in the world for people who are saying something profound and original, and you know, one of the good aspects of, you know, being a global community, global village with the internet, is that there's something valid about therapists who are famous. Whatever they're saying, there must be there must be something original and new and valid about what they're saying. So one of the main people that when you search out there in terms of couple therapies, the most famous person probably, you know, there's only a few in terms of couple therapy and love, and especially eros, is Esther Perel. So I've got included in the references, I've included a few links to what she's saying. And she's actually elaborating a fundamental idea that was formulated, I think, before her by a relational psychoanalyst called Stephen Mitchell, who wrote a book shortly before he died, much too young, who wrote a book called Can Love Last?, where he talks about this. What, you know, why doesn't desire stay alive in most committed relationships? And is there a way of understanding it psychologically, the depth of it psychologically, so we can make love last? And so Esther Perel has taken that up and she runs with it, and she's written a book called Mating in Captivity. I don't know whether you've come across it, where that's a beautiful title. That's an ingenious title that captures the main point, which is that most couples experience their commitment as a trap, as a captivity. And that therefore it is very tempting to find eros outside of it, outside of the committed relationship, almost to the point that they're incompatible. And Esther Perel, you know, you can find her on the internet, and she has given many talks that are online. I think at one point she talks about how in traditional societies, that dichotomy between security, attachment, and eros and adventure was completely taken for granted. I'm not sure that's true, but she claims that that's true. Whereas for us, of course, in modern times, we have this idea of marriage and monogamous relationships, but often people make it come true, and psychologically it seems to be true, that desire is outside the trap. Desire is experienced towards people that are outside the trap and who are unpredictable. And so she formulates this fundamental conflict, which is nothing to do with childhood wounds, or, I mean, they get mixed up with this, but even if we had no childhood wounds whatsoever, I think she would claim that this is an existential conflict in the human psyche that would happen anyway. So she formulates this conflict between security, and we can understand security or stability psychologically in terms of childhood development and attachment, and whether we experience that or not. Yeah, like in terms of attachment, there is this phrase of, do we have a secure base? Do you have a secure base within yourself psychologically? Do you feel, were you given by your caregivers, were you given a secure base within yourself? Or do you always have to desperately seek a secure base in others? So childhood development comes into this, but she would say this is an existential thing in human beings, where we seek security and stability and attachment. But eros needs space. She says here, you know, passion, I don't know, it's covered up at the moment because we've got the Zoom thing. So fire needs air. And this is one of her main ideas that she brings to the issue of love and desire and keeping desire alive, and also infidelity. She's written a second book called The State of Affairs, which is all about how to understand infidelity in monogamous relationships, and then how to recover from infidelities in a way that everybody can grow, hopefully. So this is one of the big contributions out there in the world that we can build upon. We can have some misgivings about some of her thinking, but you know, I find her inspiring. I find her useful. There is one other person who writes more about this specifically in terms of therapy, which is a colleague of mine in the States called William Cornell. And he already, I think years ago, gave a presentation on eros and the impassioned body, it's called. And I've attached it to the materials. And much of how I'm approaching this topic and this weekend, I found in there. I mean, I didn't know that he had actually so boldly and articulately already said that many years ago, that it chimes with many of the ideas that and feelings that I'm bringing to this topic and to the weekend. So I've in the materials I've highlighted it, so I suggest that is one of the first things you read, because he also has a pretty, like in my presentation here, I've prepared a kind of tour of important people and reference points that have actually spoken about this. So he says it very, very articulately and poetically in some places. I think I want to stop there. I haven't even got to my topic. Let me just give you a little, actually, I'll just give you the headlines. I'll show you the slides. So if we wanted to understand how complex our desire is, one avenue for understanding it is to understand that all the children that I ever was are alive in me, and they have desires too. And the desire I'm experiencing towards somebody is a mixture, is a combination of all those desires. Adult desires, as I said, which include the desire for self-transcendence. And what that means is my ego and defenses will be destroyed if it works well. That I would call an adult desire. That my adult desire comes packaged with, combined with, mixed with the desires of all the children I ever was. And then how do we think about these children in me? I mean, there's many ways, developmental theories that we could think about it. We could think about how Freud thought about it. You know, that there is an Oedipal child that is caught in the triangle between the parents, and that would be one of the main ways that traditionally psychoanalysis has thought about this. And that's, you know, one approximation of a description what goes wrong in relationships, but it comes with many of Freud's built-in assumptions, which are then limiting our understanding also. But even in Freud's description, we can see that he appreciates that the pre-Oedipal children, which he initially thought of as, you know, there's a state of, the infant is in a kind of narcissistic bubble. He called that narcissism. It's a bad term for that. But then that basically development, the child's development, goes through these different erotic zones of oral, anal, and genital. That's not a bad idea, I think. But then we need to, if we really want to go with the preciousness of that idea and that insight, then we would have to think that my oral child, my anal child, my genital child is alive in me, and that it isn't just that these different developmental stages are present and active in the adult. It is also that these children were emotionally wounded. And so I don't just get the oral child, I get the oral child in its typically wounded form, if that's what happened. And that means I don't just get the wound of the oral child living within me now as I'm approaching somebody as an adult. I also get the defenses that I developed against the oral wound, and that is active also. And that makes some sense, or that is one way of languaging why people are afraid of love, because their defenses are in operation in order to avoid the pain or the heartbreak or the emotional injury that they have experienced before. That's the purpose of defenses, to make sure that it never happens again. But if I have defenses against an oral longing and against an oral desire, that is going to mess up my adult loving, my adult availability to love now. And you know, very often that happens between, well, if we think in terms of heterosexual couples, that very often happens between men and women, because women the stereotype is that women want more the sensuousness that doesn't just go straight for the genitals. And that seems to be a stereotype that maybe because of the Hollywoodization of and the pornographic nature of the modern sexual imagination, it's not entirely untrue in some of the couples that I work with, that the man goes straight for the genitals. They seem to be obsessed or compelled with that kind of one-track mind. That's not entirely untrue in terms of what happens out there in couples in the world. So this is the formulation in a kind of, there's some truth and some mileage we can get out of the Freudian formulation, because it does imply what Julie was saying, that the children are alive in us now, and they join the party when we have adult desires and adult interactions. So then the next person that I want to maybe refer to, and then I'll come to a stop, is a woman who has been thinking about, and she writes complicated. I think for many of you also from Pakistan, if English is not your first language, these articles are heavy going. She's an intellectual, she's very well educated also in the history of psychoanalysis. And so these articles are heavy going for most people. But the substance is precious.
Michael,
yeah.
May I say something?
Yes, yeah, hi. Yes, say.
So I'm just thinking of what you're saying about love, right? And I'm just going back to what you said about the transcendence of love.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you do achieve love, that means love is the end. Right?
How do you mean?
That fantasy that if you get the love, it is the end, then what?
No,
and
no,
then
no.
after
No, then if you get that kind of love, then it's
there's nothing.
No, that's the beginning, because then development happens. Out of that.
You feel that if you believe and if you think on the depth level, there's nothing after death, right? There's only a promise of something. There's a promise of heal. So maybe unconsciously somewhere that death is so finite and there's so much of belief, there's no connection to spirituality or God or whatever, that after the love is...
Well, I think what typically happens, I'm thinking of examples that, couples that I've worked with. And when couples, seems to me that when couples...
Like when they grow to each other.
Have come, well, like I said, there's different kinds of loving and it's complicated. So let's just say you're cottoning on to this definition that I've proposed, that mature love requires an embracing of that element where I long to transcend myself with your love, through your love. Yeah? I'm trying to. There's an almost instinctive and also spiritual desire for your love to transform me into a bigger person. I would think that is a kind of mature love. Is that what you're talking about? You're shaking your head.
But with that is the end of love.
No,
because
that's
in your...
Because you see what you're, I don't know, maybe I didn't say this, but if I'm open to this kind of love that destroys my defenses, then one of the first things that happens is a kind of void.
Yeah.
Then out of the void, unexpectedly, in a way that my ego can't even begin to anticipate or expect or formulate, many things happen out of the void. There is a whole process that gets unleashed from within the void. And that process is... Okay.
Michael, I hear you when you say that. But then, when you think of people like Rumi or these really, far out people cross those boundaries, you see nothing but emptiness and loneliness. It's just you and your God or your spirituality. And I don't know if that is...
I don't think Rumi would agree. I don't think Rumi would say that he's lonely.
Yes, he would.
That is a projection of your ego into that state.
Actually, you're saying it from the ego perspective. Okay.
You associate that, what he's talking about, with loneliness. But I think that's your ego projecting into a valid intuition.
Isn't that the fear of everyone at the end?
I don't think your ego and my ego are qualified to talk about that.
Yeah, just thinking generally.
I'm seeing, no, that's fair enough. Look, we can speculate about it, but I think the honest answer is that until the self-transcendence to something resembling Rumi has happened, we can only speak through our ego, and our ego is limited. And for our ego, the idea of loneliness is very emotionally real. And so I think we are likely to project that into the unknown state that Rumi inhabits. I don't think he would say he's lonely. And I mean, anyway,
yeah,
Rumi,
he wouldn't say that. I'm just saying for the onlooker, like you said, the ego. For the onlooker,
that's real. Of course, that's real. Yes, of course, of course. Well, in the way that we know it, you know, whatever. I mean, we could talk for hours about the definitions of ego and what do we really mean by it, and it's very imprecise, and it's, you know, the history of that notion is very, very complicated and confusing. But whatever we mean by it, in the way that we know it in the West, when we talk about the ego, we're not just talking about ego capacities or ego faculties, you know, the skills of the ego. Like the ego, for example, is capable of what they call it, delayed gratification. You know, I have memory. Because I have memory, I can wait. I don't have to have things happen right now. That's really important in lovemaking. You know, you all know this. The ego faculty of waiting is really necessary for any kind of lovemaking, because otherwise you just want instant gratification, and it's, you know, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, and then it's over. And many teenagers, you know, that's all they ever get these days. It's an epidemic. So because they are narcissistically injured and their ego is not capable of waiting and hanging out and being patient, there's too much pressure inside for instant gratification and instant release. So that's an important faculty of human beings, to be able to wait and wait, and in the meantime pay attention to the other for a bit rather than just my gratification. So that is an important faculty of human beings, and we might call that an ego faculty. But that's typically not what we mean when we talk about the ego. By implication, when we talk about the ego, we mean the defensive ego. We mean the ego that is protective. And it's not one thing anyway. I mean, we're talking about it as if it's a thing, you know, like a reified, it's a thing, like a table, the ego. It's not, it's a process. And it's a very complex, conflicted process. But in its defensiveness, in any way that we can best articulate it, it's interested in immortality. It will keep going. It wants to keep itself alive. It wants to perpetuate itself. So the ego is very, I mean, that's why it's on, you know, people who talk about spiritual things, that you can find many spiritual disciplines where people talk about destroying the ego. I mean, who's going to do that? I mean, that's an ego idea, if there ever was one. So, because it's almost the definition of the defensive ego that it will perpetuate itself. So that's why the ego, the defensive ego, being destroyed or melted by love, deconstructed, transcended by love, is such a precious idea, because it doesn't happen internally. It happens through your love. I can't do it myself.
Yeah, that's the ultimate saving fantasy, right? I'll destroy myself to save you. Isn't that the ultimate fantasy too, of love?
No, I think that is typically a reenactment of what happened between you and your mother, or some other, you know, early caregiver.
Yes.
Let me just, I'll finish the slides. I've just stopped them. So what I just said to Hania is one illustration of this general principle that we need to understand in the depth of the psyche. We need to understand all the traces and conflicts that are left over from the desires, from the wounded desires of our childhood. They all come into the space when there is eros. They come into the space when we are attracted to somebody. They come into the space when we form attachments and commitments. All of these children are present. And many people in the West, at least, that I've worked with and couples that I work with, they have no conception that the journey of the couple will need to include hard, painful labor of recovering these children and from behind their defenses. And people, you know, are very reluctant. They're very avoidant. They are phobic of the pain that they cause each other. And Hollywood tells them that a loving couple, you will notice that most Hollywood films, you know, they only go to the wedding. Huh? They don't show what happens after the wedding. All the drama is before the wedding. And the kind of massacre that happens, the mutual hurtfulness, and people don't seem to expect it, and they don't seem to understand why it's necessary and why it's good. And then you find that a lot of couple therapy also is just trying to create harmony. So one of the things I do when I work with couples or when I teach couple therapy, that seems to be really missing out there, is some validation of the fighting. Why do couples fight? Why do they get lost in polarizations and fights and hatred, you know, all the way to the extremes? It's very rare for a couple therapist to say there's a purpose to this. We need to discover the purpose of the fighting. We need to help you fight productively rather than stop the fight. Much couple therapy tries to stop the fight. Okay, I'll leave it there. I've said enough. I think for now, there's lots of material that you can respond to. This is the kind of perspective that obviously we want to bring to couple therapy, but we also want to bring it to individual therapy. Because for many, many of your clients, all of these issues are what makes them happy and fulfilled in their lives or not. When you ask people what makes for a good life, the bulk of that is relationships. So unless we can offer a therapeutic space that is available to the complexities and the depth and the vitality of eros and the pain that comes with it and the suffering and the insecurities and the destruction that comes with it, then we're not walking our talk. We're not offering a space that is commensurate with what people are suffering in their lives anyway. So I'm imagining that some of you might be sitting there with questions like, well, how does it actually then apply to therapy? What does it mean for how you work as a therapist, and what kind of therapeutic space do you offer, and how do you position yourself as a therapist in relation to these? And you know, one crucial question in couples, but also for therapists, in couples, you would say, they say, oh, well, you know, we've lost desire and we haven't had sex for a year, and then they think, they look online, and then they go talk to their friends and they talk about sex toys and how can you stimulate desire and blah blah. Nobody ever asked the question, let's please pay attention to what you do habitually to turn the other off. There's a systematic turning off of the other, which is dominant and successful. That's much more effortlessly successful than all these efforts to regenerate desire. So we need to understand, couples need to talk about that. But the equivalent question would be valid, for us as therapists. How do you make sure that the space is unerotic? that there's no danger of any client ever feeling anything erotic in your consulting room.
There are two very interesting aspects in what I've heard so far, and many actually, and many theories untangling and all that, but the term defenses and how you have to give up or sacrifice or whatever, destroy your defenses, which kind of sounds brutal, but also leaves this hope of what is to come after that. So by itself, it gives this this tangling sensation. And the second part, which is also very interesting, is what you just now said. How can you make sure that you can protect yourself or the other person in the room or your spouse from that sensation? So, which is another defense which you try to put on.
I actually said the opposite, but never mind.
But this is how I interpret it.
Yeah, I hear you. Couples can be brutal to each other in their hurtfulness. Some couples inflict violence upon each other, but many couples inflict kind of emotional violence on each other, verbal violence. So then we need to face that there is a brutal, violent dynamic. And many couples hide that from their couple therapist because they feel ashamed of it. So many couple therapists don't quite end up getting the full picture. But I appreciate what you're saying, because when it comes to our internal attention to our defenses or defensive structures, then we do not want to be trapped just in a brutal, harsh reaction to them. We want to be able to think about melting defenses. And we want to be able to think about the child behind the defenses and what they need, and what kind of love and compassion is needed to meet and take care of their desires and their needs. Definitely, yes. So no, there needs to be, maybe I was emphasizing more the harshness and the brutality, because that is what tends to happen in couples when the frustration has accumulated for a long time, when the erotic has been avoided or denied or defended against, and people get very, very frustrated. And out of that frustration, they don't know what to do with themselves. And then a kind of brutality does arise, which we do not want to turn a blind eye to. So maybe I was emphasizing that a bit too much. I agree.
If I understood correctly, you said earlier that we are attracted to the people that will counterbalance our childhood trauma?
Yes, compensate for it. Give us some kind of promise, or some kind of appear to give us a guarantee that we won't have to feel that anymore.
So, okay, how does then Alain de Botton, you know Alain de Botton, I guess, he says that we're attracted to the people that promise to make us suffer like our parents made us suffer.
These are two truths, two sides of the same coin. They just emphasize, but they are complementary truths that make the same point.
Okay, I just wanted to ask because they sound
opposite.
Yes,
they sound opposite. There is a way of explaining this, but it would require, maybe just intuitively, we can sort of get the flavor that these are two opposite truths, but they point to the same thing, and they are two sides of the same thing. the way I formulated it is just underneath the conscious level of what the person is aware of. You know, when they are attracted and they are in love and everything is wonderful and they feel whole in a way they never did before. So that's the sort of subjective sense where a deal gets made between the two people, like a promise. It's not a spoken promise. The other person doesn't say, oh, if you commit to me, I will make sure that you will never have to feel that particular pain ever again. It's not spoken. But when you work with couples many years later, they can, with hindsight, they can speak that promise that was never spoken at the time. They can find that that was active. They think back, and then with hindsight, they can begin to understand that that promise was made, was demanded, and then made in an unspoken way. Now, what then happens, once that promise has, in a way you could say, hooked me, I've projected that promise, but the other person also, in a way, is agreeing to it. So once I'm hooked by the promise, what then happens over time is the exact opposite, which is what Alain de Botton talks about. Because why do I want a guarantee? Why is it not enough that I'm in pain? And like, you know, the previous person was saying, the marathon of the relationship will involve fatigue and pain and bleeding. And if I could sign up for that, if I could know and confront and know from the beginning that that is going to be the reality of the relationship, and I'm committed to that, you know, I'm committing to that, I know that's going to be part of it. If I can do that, I'm not going to be as shocked and disappointed as another person who is completely unaware of this. The person who's completely unaware of this, they really think, as the previous person said, you know, that this other will make me happy. Why am I so convinced of that? Not because, I mean, if you say it in an extreme way, not because they're not making me happy because they are offering me love. It's more that they're offering me perfect protection against my pain. And what then happens once I'm hooked and committed, that in the course of the relationship, they get to feel a little safer than at the beginning. At the beginning, everybody's on their best behavior and they will promise anything and everything. But then once the relationship is stable and committed, then the promise wears a little thin. And then people become a little bit more spacious and they are not on their best behavior anymore. And then the promise is beginning to be betrayed, or there is a kind of disappointment. And the person who goes into this naively, their disappointment is so much bigger and shocking and maybe traumatizing. They find that traumatizing. But then what actually happens if the guarantee is not constantly being delivered, then I start feeling my pain again. And then the other begins to resemble the parent who wounded me in the first place. So that's how these two truths hang together. They are inevitably linked, and it's inevitable. And so when we first get into a relationship and, you know, we sort of test the compatibility and we wonder, is this the right person for me, and so on. But in a way, the painful marathon, many of the painful phases of the marathon are already predictable. They're already inevitable. Once two people have chosen each other, the unpacking of that promise and the disappointment of that, and it's all inevitable. And then, of course, many couples come to therapy much too late. They have already massacred each other or disappointed each other, or they've already, you know, gone outside the relationship and broken the commitment, and that makes things so much more difficult. So many couples come to couple therapy much too late. when the hurt and the bitterness and the disappointment is already too entrenched. It's not, I'm not saying it's irrecoverable, you know, like if you offer a kind of, if you don't meet the naivety in the couple with a kind of naive couple therapy, then, you know, yes, I think it is possible sometimes to address and to work through the disappointment, and then people can get back to loving each other in a way that they thought was going to be impossible through the disappointment. So just maybe close your eyes for a minute. And just notice where you are and what has been stirred up by this so far. Just right now, how are you in your body? What's happening emotionally? What's your mind busy with? What's active in you? What's been triggered? Maybe have some idea, some sense of what it is in you that needs or wants attention. You know, for most of us, these things are very triggering, both personally and there are, of course, implications for how we work as therapists also. But I'm under no illusion how close to our hearts these conversations are. It's very few of us who are not kind of in some kind of conflict or pain about these things. So if you expose yourself to this kind of event, and you allow yourself to be triggered and stimulated, then we may want to ask the question, what kind of attention do you need now as we're coming to the end? Who would be good to give attention to you? Who do you trust to give you attention in a good way? And one of the things I'm imagining that many of you in different degrees feel vulnerable right now. There's no way that we can meaningfully engage with all of this unless we feel vulnerable. Unless, you know, our heart is sort of on the line. And most of us as therapists are old enough to have had our hearts broken at least several times over. So we're not entirely naive about these things. So just for a moment, you know, breathe into the pain and give yourself some attention. Or if not pain, then maybe vulnerability. And then, of course, inside the vulnerability, there already always is the longing. Okay. Anybody want to put something into the pot as a concluding, don't open up new things, more a kind of closing. If you feel like contributing like a closing statement, something that...
I'd like to bring in my sore heart, and I was musing on the defense of neglected child parts that can go into, oh, I don't need anyone, I'll just I just kind of, you know, I'll just avoid that completely. And I was curious that I was also with, oh, what's going on around gender identity, and I want to be careful because I don't want to pathologize that in any way, but I'm also curious how that comes up in myself and is coming up collectively in our society. And my hunch that there, and my experience in working with this, is that there's so much more to this than has a current language. And there's also a sense of taboo about kind of going into it too much. This could also be me winding up because I'm trying to get away from that other kind of the neglected child part. But I do notice my curiosity about gender identity.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
There's one, I think it was included in the materials. There's one paper by Jodie Messler-Davis that speaks to that, that expands beyond the Freud's heteronormativity in an interesting way. So yeah, people are thinking about that.
Yeah.
So if that paper is not included, then just ask me for it. It's called From the Oedipus complex to Oedipal complexity. You can probably find it online. Jodie Messler-Davis.
Thank you.
She's an exquisite thinker and writer. So she's a gift in this, especially in this realm of the erotic and sexuality and a deep understanding. She has really made some very extraordinary, precious contributions over the decades. I mean, she's been at it for, yeah, I think 3 decades, and you can see her developing thinking, and it's really helpful.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking maybe saying something about the weekend. I'm not sure whether this is true or whether you can feel that or identify with that, but you know, there's lots of shame around this topic, and I don't know whether I'm reading the atmosphere via the screens. It's all very, you know, cyberspace interferes, but I do think if I had to say what's the group atmosphere, which would be a whole lot easier to say if we were sitting in a room together, but if I had to speculate, I would say there is a kind of vulnerability that has some shame in it, and that's obviously, if we were to really work on this on the weekend, we need to be gentle and delicate with this, and we need to take that into account, that to expose anything about this topic is dynamite. It's dangerous, and so we do want to be tender and careful with that, as well as passionate. Maybe in the way that I've been speaking, I've been more emphasizing the passionate side, but the tenderness is equally important. And we want to make that part of the weekend. For those of you who haven't attended weekends with me before, I'm always aiming at some kind of integration between some theory, some role play type experiential work, some small groups, some maybe demonstration in the middle where I maybe work with somebody or do supervision with somebody. So it's a mixture. It's meant to be a mixture. It's not going to be like this. I mean, this is in a way much safer for you because you can just sit there. You can come, you can leave. You don't have to expose yourself. You can just listen to me ramble on. But of course, the weekend is going to be very different. It's not going to be talking a lot or all the time. If we want this to impact you and your practice, then we need to make it more experiential rather than one-sided. But then, of course, it is going to be more exposing also. So yes, it's going to be a mixture of these different things. And the 3 topics, maybe I just share that. I think it was up on the screen. I don't know whether you could see it. So if you read the article, I suggest, certainly if you want to come to the weekend, read the article and see whether that makes sense to you. And the main topics that I want to put into the pot or offer as a kind of framework for thinking about it are these 3 topics there at the bottom. These are the ones I will prepare. There may be other things that happen depending on what you bring to the weekend. But these are the 3 main topics that I've prepared and have done some thinking about. So the conflicted field of the erotic between the different kinds of love and loving, which I think is an existential thing. Like I said earlier, even if none of us were carrying any childhood wounds or defenses, there would still be existential dilemmas about the erotic. But then all of that gets exacerbated and hugely complicated. And also, well, because one main reason is because the defenses enter the picture and protections against love. We're not just seeking love, we're also protecting ourselves against it. That hugely complicates things. So then that is going to be an important topic. The woundings of love and how does our biography prepare us for love and sex and intimacy, or not? How does it handicap us? And what we use for that, for the depth of investigating that, are all these developmental theories. But then, as I was just talking with Julie about Jodie Mesler-Davis, our developmental theories themselves are somewhat handicapped. They're not really the best tools for beginning to understand or make sense of these things, because they also have a history, a limited history. And so there are ways of thinking about it and conceptualizing how the developmental wounds come into this that are more or less helpful. But then, of course, we want to work on that also experientially. And then the third topic, which I haven't mentioned at all tonight, is the paradox between self and other, and which I think is in a way a better formulation than Esther Perel's formulation between security and adventure. It's between subjectifying and objectifying, between making love to a subject, but also making love to somebody who is willing to engage as my object, as an object of my imagination. Generally speaking, in the culture, in postmodernism, we are horrified, quite rightly so, of how much human beings can dehumanize and objectify each other. And we have a kind of cultural understanding of that now, and a judgment of that. But unfortunately, what happens between human beings also in love is that we do use each other, and using each other as objects constitutes quite a large chunk of satisfying interactions between humans. So that's where postmodernism needs to get a bit beyond itself, because we want to, in order to really understand eros, we need to understand, I propose, this paradox between treating the other as a subject, meeting them as a subject, and treating them as an object. And that there's something precious about both of those. You know, you can find many modern relationships where young couples often are best friends, but they never have sex. They're more like brother and sister. And they really exquisitely support each other, and they meet each other supposedly as subjects, but there's just no passion at all. All of that is taboo and avoided. So that's where the objectifying then ends up becoming completely desireless, or passionless. So that's the third topic. So these topics are the ones that I've been thinking about in preparing for the weekend, and that I will offer to you. If it depends on the group dynamic and how it evolves. Those of you who've worked with me before know that none of that is set in stone, and if something doesn't seem relevant, I'm very happily prepared to drop that. But that's the idea for the weekend, and I think there are still places available. And I think that's all I want to say for now, for tonight.
I would just like to thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting and insightful.
Good. Thank you.